It was a breezy afternoon in downtown Philadelphia. The smell of fresh coffee drifted through a small, cozy café near the corner of a bustling street. People wandered in, ordering lattes or cappuccinos, settling at wooden tables to check their phones or chat quietly with friends. In a warm spot by the window sat Ivanka Trump, dressed casually in a simple blazer and jeans, trying her best to blend into the background. She was often recognized, her life in the spotlight making her every move subject to public scrutiny, but here, she was just another person craving a moment of normalcy. She took a slow sip of her latte, gazing out at the busy sidewalk. It was a rare chance to escape the clamor of political controversies and business meetings. Since her father, Donald Trump, had served as president, Ivanka had found herself either praised or criticized, rarely anything in between. She exhaled, letting the rich aroma of coffee calm her nerves. For a few minutes, she allowed herself to imagine she was anonymous. Suddenly, the front door of the cafe swung open, and a man in his late 40s stormed in. He wore clothes that seemed worn but not ragged, like someone who had once been in a better place. His face looked weathered, like he'd seen too many disappointments in too short a time. At first, he appeared to be just another customer, someone coming in from the chilly air outside. But then his eyes locked on Ivanka. He paused for a moment, blinking as if he couldn't quite believe who he was seeing. The air in the cafe seemed to tighten. People around him continued sipping their drinks, unaware of the rising tension, until he spoke. "So, you think you're better than the rest of us, huh?" His voice was sharp and carried across the small room, halting conversations. Heads turned. The barista, who had been frothing milk, froze mid-action. The man's tone dripped with anger. Ivanka looked up from her cup, confusion flickering across her face. She'd been caught off guard. Instead of standing or retreating, she stayed seated, her expression uncertain but composed. She saw the hostility in his eyes and realized, he knew exactly who she was. His words came in a rush, as if he'd been waiting a long time to spit them out. Your father, you both think you can just do whatever you want. Dismantle people's lives, ruin families, and then waltz around like you own the place." A murmur spread among the other patrons. Some recognized Ivanka now, eyes widening at the unfolding confrontation. Others just sensed the conflict and watched with growing unease. Ivanka set her latte down carefully. There was a slight tremor in her hand, but she kept her voice calm. "I'm sorry you're upset," she said softly. "Is there something I can do to help?" That only seemed to inflame him further. "Help? Do you have any idea what your father's policies did to people like me? Lost my job, had to move, no health coverage. I voted against him, rejected everything he stood for, but none of it mattered, did it? He became president anyway, and the rest of us got left behind." His voice shook with emotion. He was clearly on the verge of losing his composure, and Ivanka could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on them. She remembered the countless times she had been yelled at or confronted by people who disagreed with her father's administration, but rarely had she seen such raw despair. The man gave a bitter laugh. "And here you are, sipping coffee, in your fancy clothes, acting like you don't have a care in the world. You and your family, you're all the same." Ivanka's heart pounded. She knew how to handle polite discussions, heated debates with journalists, or calm negotiations with business partners. But face-to-face anger, this personal, felt different. She took a steadying breath. "Sir," she said, her voice still controlled. "I'm not denying how you feel. Believe me, I've seen and heard a lot of perspectives on my father, on our family. But blaming me for all your pain may not ease it. A hush settled over the cafe. The barista hovered behind the counter, unsure whether to call security or simply let this play out. The customers shifted nervously in their seats. The man's jaw clenched, and he stepped closer to Ivanka's table. You want to talk about pain? You don't know the first thing about pain. He glanced at the empty chair across from her but remained standing. I worked for 30 years at a plant that closed down after new trade policies came into play. Not just closed, shut down overnight. My wife left me when the money ran out, took the kids. Said she couldn't handle living on the edge all the time. And you want to say you understand? Ivanka swallowed hard, empathy washing over her face. She gestured gently toward the chair. Would you like to sit? I can't pretend to have lived your life, but maybe I can listen. He glared, fists clenched. For a second, it looked like he might explode again. Then, almost reluctantly, he dragged the chair out and sat down. His posture was stiff, arms folded across his chest, but there was a hint of exhaustion beneath his anger. Fine, he muttered. Let's hear what you've got to say, though I doubt it'll change anything. Ivanka let a moment of silence linger, giving him a chance to breathe. Then she spoke in a low, steady voice. I won't tell you that I've struggled like you. Because I haven't. I've had privileges and comforts. But I have felt judged my entire life, especially in the last few years. People see my last name and decide who I am before I open my mouth. They look at me and think I don't care, or that I can't understand hardship. He scoffed. That's not real hardship. That's people not liking you because of your politics. She nodded. It's different, yes. But it still hurts to be seen as nothing more than a villain. And I know people have been hurt. I'm not dismissing that, especially if my father's presidency and policies affected your job or your family's stability. But I don't want to dismiss you either. That's why I want to hear about what you've been through. He looked away for a second, jaw working as though he were trying to keep his composure. The cafe patrons watched, some leaning forward in their seats, others covering their mouths in anxious anticipation. All right, he finally said, his voice lower now. Here's my story. He explained that his factory job vanished when the company relocated overseas. He'd been there for decades, believed in loyalty and hard work. But that loyalty didn't stop the bills from piling up or save his marriage from collapsing. And yes, he blamed Donald Trump's administration, believed the economic direction taken under Trump didn't help workers like him. He resented the rhetoric, the tension, the feeling that the country was tearing at the seams. And as Donald Trump's daughter, Ivanka symbolized everything he felt had gone wrong. As he spoke, his tone shifted from raw anger to something more vulnerable. His voice cracked when he talked about losing his wife's support, about looking into his children's eyes and feeling like a failure. A hush blanketed the cafe. Even the espresso machine, still steaming milk, seemed muted by the weight of his words. When he finished, his hands were trembling. He stared at the tabletop as though he might fall apart if he looked up. Ivanka leaned forward, her own eyes misty with empathy. I'm sorry for what you've been through, she said, her voice sincere, almost a whisper. I don't have the power to give you back your job, or rebuild your family. But please know that I do hear you. And I understand your anger toward me. If I were in your position, I might feel the same. He sniffed, wiping at his eyes. Yeah, well. I guess I never expected you to actually listen. His gaze flicked around the cafe, noticing that everyone was watching, but not with judgment anymore. Most looked moved, concerned. A few dabbed at tears. Ivanka reached out slowly, placing her hand on the table, not touching him, but close enough that he could feel the gesture was genuine. I can't fix everything. But maybe we could start with understanding each other better. I promise I'll take what you've told me to heart. He let out a long breath, shoulders sagging. I'm so used to politicians who don't care, or people with money who'd rather ignore people like me. I never thought one of you would sit here, listening like this. Ivanka offered a small, sad smile. Well, if there's one thing I've learned, it's that listening can go a long way. He looked at her for a long moment, and in his eyes, you could see his guard lowering, just a little. I've spent so many years angry, blaming your father, blaming you, blaming anyone who seemed to have it easier. It was easier to hate the name, Trump, than to face how helpless I felt. And I know it sounds crazy, but maybe I even hope you become president one day. Then maybe, just maybe, someone in that big chair will finally do something for people like me. A faint murmur rippled through the café, as though everyone had taken a collective breath. Ivanka seemed momentarily taken aback by his words. Her eyes softened in genuine surprise. I never expected to hear something like that from you, she admitted. But it means a lot. I promise I won't forget what you've told me here today. He gave a heavy shrug, his anger drained, replaced by a weary kind of acceptance. I've spent so long yelling at the TV, cursing your father's name, cursing you too, sometimes, for being part of it all. I figured you were just another politician's kid who wouldn't look twice at a guy like me. But you sat here, you listened. Ivanka nodded slowly. Anger can feel like it's the only power left when you've lost so much. I get that, and I know me sitting here doesn't fix anything overnight. But I do think it's a start. They fell silent for a few seconds. Nobody in the café dared to speak, as though breaking the moment would shatter the fragile bond forming between them. A distant hiss from the espresso machine provided the only background noise. The man dropped his gaze to the table, his voice trembling just a bit. I spent so long wanting someone to care. I never dreamed that someone could be you. Ivanka swallowed, her own emotions catching in her throat. I won't pretend I can right every wrong. But I want you to know you're not invisible. I see you. He exhaled with a shaky breath, releasing years of pent-up frustration. Maybe I owe you an apology, for coming in here and yelling at you like that. I just saw your face and everything poured out. All that hurt, frustration. I don't know what came over me. She drew in a slow breath. I accept your apology. And I understand. If I can ever help you, really help in some small way, let me know. And if it ever comes to me running for office, I'll remember you, and this conversation. The man gave a rueful chuckle. Not sure how you'd help someone like me, but I appreciate the gesture. And yeah, if the day comes and your name is on a ballot, maybe I'll actually vote for a Trump. A few scattered claps broke out from the tables nearby. He turned, startled, and saw that half the café was smiling at him. One older woman in the corner dabbed at her eyes, nodding softly, as if to say, it's going to be okay. He cleared his throat, standing up a bit awkwardly. I should get going. Thank you, for listening. Ivanka stood as well, offering her hand. I hope things get better for you, she said quietly. Truly. He hesitated, then shook her hand. It was a firm handshake, a gesture of respect that just moments ago would have been unthinkable. With a final nod to the watching patrons, he walked out into the Philadelphia afternoon. The café felt warmer somehow, as though the tension had been replaced by a collective sense of relief, and maybe a hint of hope. Ivanka sat back down, realizing her latte had gone cold. She picked it up anyway, taking a slow sip. A woman approached her table, eyes shining with gratitude. "That was incredible," the woman whispered. "You too, you just reminded everyone in here that maybe we're not as divided as we think." Ivanka exhaled, shoulders slumping as the adrenaline began to fade. "I hope so." She stayed a while longer, finishing her drink and speaking softly with a few curious patrons who ventured closer. Nobody demanded selfies or autographs, they just wanted to offer a word of encouragement or share a small piece of their own story. By the time she left, the cafe felt like a place of connection rather than conflict. Stepping outside, Ivanka looked down the sidewalk, half expecting to see the man lingering somewhere, but he was gone. She whispered under her breath, "I hope he finds what he's looking for." And with that, she walked off into the crowd, the city noise swallowing her figure as she blended back into the current of people passing by, each with their own story. Yet the memory of that unexpected conversation lingered, a reminder that sometimes, truly listening, offering even a moment of honest empathy, can soften the hardest hearts.